All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is selective blindness and the lost art of strategic ignorance. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the trap of total awareness, training your blind spots, sustaining the narrow gaze, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this training along with its respective document, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters on how to improve every aspect of your life, then make sure to join the free newsletter, again, from the link in the description. With that said, let's get started and talk about the trap of total awareness. So we've been told pretty much our entire lives that seeing more is always better, that the sharpest person in the room is really the one who notices everything and misses absolutely nothing. And honestly, on the surface, it sounds right, because how could paying attention ever be a bad thing, right? But there's a difference that almost nobody really talks about between awareness that makes you more focused and awareness that scatters your focus across a dozen targets at once. And most of us are drowning in the second kind and don't even realize it, because the overwhelm feels like engagement, and engagement feels like progress even when it's not. So the modern world has turned information access into something that feels like power. But for most people, it actually functions as a slow acting poison that quietly dissolves their ability to commit to anything for longer than a couple of weeks. So you scroll, you research, you stay informed, and all of it feels productive because your brain genuinely feels busy processing input. But being busy and making progress are not the same thing. And what makes this so difficult to catch is that the majority of what you take in on any given day has almost nothing to do with the one thing you're supposedly working towards, and yet it occupies real mental bandwidth that you never fully get back. So your attention is finite, it's truly finite. And every notification, every trending topic, every casual, oh, you should look into this conversation, is really pulling from the same reservoir of focus that your actual meaningful work depends on. So by the time you actually sit down to do the thing that matters, the tank is already running low before you've even started. And the sneaky part is that consuming content about your goals, or watching breakdowns of other people's success, or watching videos on business strategy or whatever, creates this convincing feeling of movement, almost like a mental rehearsal that tricks your brain into thinking you've done something when you haven't. And it compounds too, because one piece of irrelevant information is pretty harmless on its own, but hundreds of them per day, stacked across weeks and months, creates a fog that makes it genuinely hard to remember what you even sat down to do in the first place. And it goes well beyond just digital, because even legitimate opportunities can function as distractions when they pull your energy away from the primary commitment you've already made to yourself. A good option is still a distraction if it's not the right option for where you are right now. And most people never learn to make that distinction, because good feels close enough to right that they don't question it. So the person staring at 10 possible paths forward is, in a very real and measurable way, less free than the person who only sees one, because the cognitive load of evaluating and comparing 10 directions burns through the exact energy you would need to actually walk any single one of them with conviction. So every time you entertain an alternative, even casually, even just keeping it on the radar, like most people like to say, you're quietly chipping away at the internal certainty that makes execution on the main thing feel effortless. And so being smart actually makes this problem worse. The more perceptive you are, the more patterns you notice, the more connections you see between things, and all of that mental horsepower becomes a liability when it's pointed in every direction simultaneously. Smart people often struggle with focus more than anyone else, because their minds are genuinely capable of engaging with so many things at once that narrowing down feels like a waste of their own ability. And there's this tendency, especially among ambitious and driven people, to turn simple decisions into elaborate multivariable analysis, because the analytical brain wants to account for everything before committing. But the truth is, you can't, right? That perfect information never arrives. It never has and never will. And the pursuit of total clarity before you take action is really just a sophisticated version of procrastination. So you tell yourself you're being thorough, you're telling yourself you're being strategic, being responsible, but what you're actually doing is rehearsing the decision instead of making it. And each additional hour of deliberation just adds more weight to a choice that was honestly pretty clear from the start. And the cruel irony is that your ability to see nuance and complexity, which is a genuine strength in many contexts, becomes the exact thing that keeps you stuck when the moment calls for simple, decisive, unglamorous forward movement. And there's a version of this that hits creative people especially hard as well, because genuine curiosity, the kind that makes you interesting and good at what you do, also makes everything look fascinating when you should be boring yourself with repetition and consistency. Because curiosity without boundaries is really just wandering, and wandering can look romantic from the outside from time to time, but it doesn't really always move you forward to your goal. So new projects, new tools, new frameworks, new approaches, they all trigger that little dopamine hit of novelty that makes the current work feel stale by comparison, even when the current work is the exact thing that would change your life if you stayed with it for another 6 months. So real mastery, the kind that actually pays off, requires you to find fascination inside repetition rather than looking for it in new stimuli, which is basically the opposite of what your curious brain naturally wants to do. And it doesn't help that the world around you is actively reinforcing the idea that total awareness is a virtue, something to aspire to and perform publicly. Staying informed has essentially become a kind of a social currency, especially in professional and entrepreneurial circles where not knowing the latest trend or development or platform shift feels almost irresponsible. So the problem isn't just internal, it's environmental. You're swimming against a current that treats your deliberate ignorance as negligence. And a huge percentage of information consumption isn't actually about learning or improving at all. It's about signaling. People read and share and discuss things not because the information changes their behavior, but because being seen as informed validates their identity as serious, competent, relevant people. And when you opt out of that performance, you're not just changing a habit, you're stepping outside of a social game that most of your peers are still playing. And that's why it can feel difficult. And in a lot of circles, knowing things has become a status marker that operates almost identically to material wealth, where the person who can reference the most recent study or article or market move is treated as the most credible voice in the room, regardless of whether any of that knowledge has translated into actual results for them. And once you see this dynamic for what it really is, a status game dressed up as intellectual seriousness, it becomes much easier to opt out of it without feeling like you're falling behind, because you realize that the people who seem most informed are often the ones producing the least. And there's also a quieter, more personal version of this, which is the feeling that you should be aware of what's happening in the world as some kind of moral obligation, that deliberately tuning things out makes you selfish or privileged or disconnected. And that framing is powerful because it wraps the habit of overconsumption in the language of responsibility, which makes it almost impossible to question without feeling like a bad person. But awareness and action are not the same thing, and the person who is deeply informed about 12 different problems while solving none of them is not really any more virtuous than the person who ignores 11 and makes real progress on one. So the end result of all of this unchecked seeing, all of this awareness without filters, is really a strange kind of sophisticated paralysis where you know a lot, you've considered everything, and you do almost nothing. And it doesn't look like laziness from the inside, right? It feels like you're preparing yourself. It feels like due diligence. But from the outside and from the vantage point of your future self looking back, it's really just standing still with extra steps. So the tragedy of this is that the people stuck in this loop are usually the ones that with the most potential, because they wouldn't be overwhelmed with options if they weren't genuinely capable of pursuing several of them successfully, right? But capability without actually committing to anything just produces a really impressive list of things you almost did, which is honestly worse than having no options at all. Because it's worse to have all these options and not take action on any of them, right? It's worse than having no options at all. And there's a kind of movement that isn't actually going anywhere. And you've probably felt it, that sense of being exhausted at the end of the day without really being able to point to a single thing that moved the needle, because all of your energy went into processing rather than producing. And the longer this goes on, the more it shifts from a temporary phase into a permanent mode of operating, where the gap between what you know you're capable of and what you've actually done just keeps widening until it becomes its own source of anxiety. And I'm saying all of this from personal experience, by the way. I was the same way for years on end. And what's wild is that most people in the state are actually waiting without realizing it for some kind of permission to really stop looking around and just focus on one thing. And this was me. They want someone or something to narrow the field for them, to tell them that what they're thinking about doing is actually valid and that they can actually do it. Because choosing feels like closing doors, and closing doors feels like a loss. But that's exactly the shift we need to talk about next, because the skill of deliberately choosing what not to see is something you can actually develop. Nobody's coming to make the choice for you, and the longer you actually wait for clarity to arrive on its own, the more you're training yourself in the habit of hesitation rather than the habit of decision. And the good news, and it really is good news, is that this pattern breaks the moment you stop treating awareness as universally positive and start treating it as something that needs to be managed, directed, and sometimes deliberately shut off. So let's talk about training your blind spots. So if the problem is too much sight, too much seeing, then the solution isn't really just willpower or motivation or any of the standard advice about staying focused. The solution is developing a genuine skill, a practiced ability to not see certain things on purpose, to build real blind spots where open windows used to be. And that probably sounds strange, maybe even irresponsible, because we've been trained to believe that ignorance is always a flaw. But there's a massive difference between ignorance that happens to you and ignorance that you choose, right? And that chosen version is one of the most powerful tools you'll ever develop, knowing what to close your eyes to. Now, Greg McKeown put it well in Essentialism when he wrote that if you don't prioritize yourself, someone else will, right? And what we're really talking about here is the most aggressive form of prioritization there is. So the first real move and action here is an audit, and an audit of every single information source that currently has access to your attention. So newsletters, group chats, social feeds, podcasts, news outlets, even certain conversations with certain people. All of it needs to be evaluated not by whether it's interesting or valuable in the abstract, but by whether it directly serves the one thing you've committed to right now. And right now matters because something can be genuinely useful for a future version of you while being actively harmful to the present one, right? So start by listing every recurring input in your daily or weekly life and be honest about it, because most people dramatically underestimate how many streams of information they're passively absorbing. The podcast you listen to on your commute, the industry newsletter you skim but never act on, the group chat that occasionally has a good link buried under 40 messages of BS. All of these cost something, even when they feel free. And each source carries what you might think of as an attention tax, a small but real deduction from your daily focus budget that happens whether you consciously engage with it or not just by knowing it exists, just by knowing it exists and might contain something relevant. So the question to ask about each one isn't, is this good content or could this be useful someday? Because that would make almost anything useful someday, right? You can keep basically everything if you evaluate it through that question. But rather, has this directly contributed to progress on my primary goal in the last 30 days? And if the answer is no, it should go, right? And where it gets uncomfortable is what you need to cut will be genuinely good stuff sometimes. High quality content, smart people, real opportunities, maybe this channel. The discipline of subtraction, which is what we're really practicing here, isn't really about eliminating junk. Eliminating junk is easy and you should have already done it. The hard part is eliminating good things that aren't the right things, and most people never get past this step but it's good though. Feels like a sufficient reason to keep something around. So a useful podcast that doesn't serve your current trajectory is still a distraction. It's just a high quality distraction, right? Which honestly makes it more dangerous than a low quality one because it's harder to justify removing. So expect to feel a genuine sense of loss when you start cutting, and don't treat that feeling as a sign you're making a mistake. It's actually confirmation that you're sacrificing something real, which is exactly what meaningful focus requires. Now, the moment you start actually doing this, actually going dark on certain inputs and closing off certain channels of awareness, you're going to hit a wall of emotional resistance that's stronger than you'd expect. And it will show up as anxiety, as fear, as this persistent low-grade feeling that you're missing something important. And you need to understand that this feeling is the trap itself. It's not a signal to reverse course. Your nervous system has been conditioned to treat information gaps as threats because for most of human history they were. But in the current environment where information is infinite and attention is scarce, that ancient wiring works against you. Not only that, but information is easily accessible. You don't have to really look for it that much. So the specific fear that comes up most often is some version of, what if I miss the thing that would have changed everything? And it's worth sitting with that for a second because it reveals a hidden belief that your success really depends on finding the right piece of external information rather than executing consistently on what you already know. And that belief is really doing more damage than any single distraction ever could. Yes, you probably already have enough information to make serious progress on your primary goal right now, today, without learning a single new thing. You've probably consumed enough information to do that. And the compulsion to keep gathering more is really functioning as a buffer between you and the discomfort of actually doing the boring thing. So there's a point, and most people passed it a long time ago, where additional input starts producing diminishing returns that eventually go negative, where knowing more actually makes you less effective because it introduces doubt and complexity into situations that call for simplicity and action, or into situations that are way more simple than the content out there might make them seem. And so there's another layer here, which is the social layer of resistance, which is its own beast, because the people around you will absolutely notice when you stop keeping up with certain conversations, trends, and updates, and some of them will interpret your deliberate ignorance as arrogance or even laziness or disengagement. And that pressure can be real, and you shouldn't pretend it doesn't exist. But people who are used to you being the person who knows about everything will feel a kind of essentially dissonance when you stop performing that role, and some will actively try to pull you back into it because your awareness validated their own habits of overconsumption. And you don't need to explain your entire philosophy to everyone, but you do need a simple, non-defensive way to redirect conversations that try to drag you into territory you've chosen to ignore. Something as basic as, "I'm just not tracking that right now," is surprisingly powerful when you say it without apology. And over time, the people who respect your boundaries around attention will self-select into your inner circle. And the ones who don't will drift away, which is actually one of the hidden benefits of this whole practice. Now, once you've started cutting and pushed through the initial wave of resistance, there's also a deeper piece of work that makes the whole thing sustainable, which is fundamentally changing the story you tell yourself about what it means to not know something. Because right now, for most people, "I don't know about that" carries a subtle emotional charge of egoistic inadequacy, meaning it starts from the ego, or maybe they feel like they're falling behind. And as long as that association stays intact, your blindness will always feel like something you're enduring rather than something you're choosing from a position of strength. So you need to pay attention to how you talk to yourself about your own ignorance, even internally, right? Because the words you use shape the experience. There's a world of difference between "I have no idea what's going on with that," spoken with a hint of shame, and the same sentence spoken with genuine, almost amused indifference. The content is identical, but the posture is completely different, right? And it's the posture that determines whether your selective blindness feels like you're being deprived or whether you're being liberated. So when someone brings up a topic you've deliberately chosen to ignore, and you can say, "Yeah, I'm not tracking that," with the same energy you used to say, "I don't watch that show," which is casual, unbothered, or completely at peace with the gap, you've essentially crossed a meaningful threshold in this practice. And the goal is to really reach a place where your not knowing feels like a flex rather than a flaw, where it communicates seriousness of purpose rather than laziness or disconnection. And the only way to get there is by consciously rewriting the internal narrative every time the old story of inadequacy tries to reassert itself. And at an even deeper level, this reframe touches on your relationship with certainty and control. The compulsion to stay informed is often rooted in a belief that more information equals more control over outcomes. And loosening that belief, genuinely accepting that you really can't control everything and that trying to is itself a form of self-sabotage, is really what allows selective blindness to stop feeling risky. And you're going to start feeling more grounded. right? And there's a version of this that looks almost like surrender, not in the passive defeated sense, but in the strategic sense of a person who has decided that they would rather go deep into uncertainty on one path than stay shallow across many paths where the illusion of control keeps them comfortable but stuck. So, practically, what does this actually look like day to day? Well, it looks like building a small, repeatable structure that makes ignorance the default rather than something you have to effortfully maintain. Because if staying blind requires willpower in every moment, you'll fail, right? The goal is to set up your environment and your routines so that irrelevant information has to genuinely fight to reach you rather than flowing in freely while you fight to resist it. So your physical and digital environment should be engineered to reduce input, not maximize it. This means things like turning off notifications, not one by one as they annoy you, but wholesale as a blanket policy, and then selectively turning back on only the tiny handful that are directly tied to your current primary work. Most of the information you consume arrives not because you actively sought it, but because the default settings on your devices and platforms are designed to push it on you. So changing those defaults is really the single highest leverage environmental intervention you can really make. And your physical workspace matters too, because visual clutter and ambient noise function as low-level attention drains that really accumulate throughout the day. So a clean, sparse environment is about creating really a space where your eyes and your mind have nowhere to wander. So if you absolutely need to check certain sources or, of course, stay updated on certain topics, then batch that consumption into a single narrow window, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour in the morning, rather than grazing on it throughout the day and just checking information while you're supposed to be working. The difference between those two approaches is enormous, because batching preserves the contiguous blocks of uninterrupted focus that are where all the real progress happens. So think of it like this: information consumption, when you do it, should feel like a deliberate task with a start time and an end time, essentially. Not like a background process that's always running and occasionally pulling your attention away from whatever you're doing. And when the window closes, it should close for the day. You'll feel the pull to keep scrolling, to follow one more thread, to check one more thing. And that pull is the exact muscle you're training against. So every time you close the window on time, you're strengthening the same capacity that makes sustained focus possible in every other area of your life. So let's talk about actually sustaining the narrow gaze. So everything we've covered so far, the awareness trap, the cutting, the resistance, the environmental design, all of it is honestly the easier part. The harder part is really sustaining it over weeks and months and years, because selective blindness isn't a decision you make once and then coast on. It's an ongoing discipline that gets tested constantly by new opportunities, by new platforms, by new videos, by shifting circumstances, by your own restless mind looking for something fresh to chew on. And the initial commitment feels almost big and decisive, right? But the real work is in the thousands of quiet moments afterward, where you choose again to keep your gaze narrow when everything around you is begging you to look up. So your peripheral vision, metaphorically speaking, never actually turns off. Even after you've cut inputs and built routines and restructured your environment, your mind will keep catching glimpses of things happening outside of your chosen lane. And each glimpse is a small test of your commitment. Sometimes it's a friend's success in a different field making you wonder if you picked the wrong thing. Sometimes it's a market shift that seems like it might change everything. Sometimes it's just boredom, plain and simple. The kind that makes your current path basically feel small and repetitive compared to the vast, interesting world you've deliberately stopped tracking, because the grass is always greener, right? Now, the doubt that really shows up in these moments isn't a sign of weakness or poor planning. It's a completely natural response to the discomfort of voluntary constraint. Every person who has ever committed to something long enough to achieve mastery has felt this exact same pull. This whisper that maybe the grass is greener somewhere outside the fence you've built for yourself. So expecting the doubt, preparing for it, and treating it as part of the process rather than an interruption of the process is what separates people who sustain focus from people who restart every few months with a new strategy and a fresh burst of enthusiasm that fades just as fast as the last one. In fact, the presence of doubt can actually serve as an indicator that you're going deep enough for it to really matter, because if you had shallow commitment, well, that never really triggers this kind of resistance. If you're not periodically tempted to abandon your narrow path, you're probably not narrow enough. So learn your specific triggers, the situations and emotional states that are most likely to send your attention scattering in all sorts of different directions. Now, for some people, it's stress, which makes escapism through information feel soothing. For others, it's success, which creates a dangerous confidence that they can now handle more inputs without losing focus. And for a lot of people, it's simply the transition between tasks, those small gaps in the day where the mind reaches for stimulation because it doesn't know how to just be still for 90 seconds. So once you've identified your personal trigger patterns, you can build specific responses to each one, which are small predetermined moves that redirect your attention back to center before the peripheral pull gains enough momentum to carry you off course. And this is really the one place where heightened self-awareness actually helps you rather than hurts you, because you can turn that perceptiveness inward. Watch your own attention the way you used to watch the market or the competition or the news, and get genuinely skilled at noticing when your gaze is starting to drift before it fully breaks. And the moment of drift, that first flicker of curiosity towards something outside of your lane, is cheap and easy to correct. The moment after you've already clicked, already engaged, or already spent 20 minutes down a rabbit hole, that's expensive. And the recovery time is always longer than the detour itself. And then there's the people factor, which honestly never goes away entirely, which is the world is full of well-meaning individuals who will constantly, sometimes aggressively, try to broaden your field of vision because they genuinely believe they're helping. Have you seen this? You should really look into that. I can't believe you're not paying attention to what's happening with ... These aren't obviously attacks of some sort. These are invitations, and that's what makes them so hard to decline, because the person offering them usually cares about you and truly thinks more information will serve you. But over time, you'll develop a kind of social shorthand for these interactions, ways of essentially acknowledging the person's intention while firmly declining the input. And the key word there is firmly, because ambiguity here is pretty deadly. If people sense that you're maybe interested, that you might look into it later, they'll keep bringing things to your door, and each item they bring is another small crack in the wall you've worked so hard to build. So something like, I appreciate that, but I'm deliberately not tracking anything outside of X right now, works because it communicates intentionality. People respond very differently to deliberate ignorance than to accidental ignorance. And so framing your boundaries as a strategy rather than an oversight will change the entire dynamic. And you'll have to say some version of this many times to the same people, which can feel tedious and even a little socially awkward. But think of it as training their expectations the same way you've trained your own, and understand that the awkwardness fades once people internalize that this is just how you are now, right? That this is your new standard. Now, the deeper move, if you're willing to make it, is gradually restructuring your social environment so that the people closest to you share your understanding of focus and don't constantly test it. Now, this doesn't mean cutting people out of your life, but it does mean being thoughtful about who gets the most access to your time and attention, and whether those people amplify your commitment or quietly erode it. So you become, whether you like it or not, a kind of the average of the attention habits of the 5 or 6 people you spend the most time with. So if those people are scattered and constantly chasing new information or constantly consuming, some of that energy will seep into your own behavior regardless of how strong your personal systems are. On the flip side, your own discipline in this area will start to influence the people around you, and you might be surprised how many of them are actually quietly craving permission to also be a bit ignorant to what's happening, to also narrow their own focus, but didn't know it was an option until they watched you do it. Now, something that doesn't get talked about enough in the focus and discipline space is that what you choose to be blind to should actually shift over time as your goals evolve and your circumstances change. Selective blindness isn't obviously a fixed state, it's a living practice. And so treating it like a one-time setup leads to its own kind of rigidity where you're ignoring things out of habit rather than being strategic about it. The whole point of this is intentionality. So periodically stepping back to reassess what belongs inside your field of vision and what doesn't is really part of the discipline, not a violation of it. So the key is to recalibrate on a schedule you decide in advance rather than in the moment when something shiny catches your attention, because the moment of temptation is the absolute worst time to evaluate whether your current boundaries still make sense. Something like a quarterly review where you actually sit down and honestly assess whether your blind spots are still serving your current trajectory gives you the space to make clear-headed adjustments without abandoning the practice altogether. And during that review, the questions are simple but need to be answered, right? Has my primary goal changed enough that my current blind spots are blocking relevant information? Is there a new input that has genuine strategic value for where I'm heading now, not where I was 6 months ago? And most importantly, am I being tempted to reopen my awareness because something has actually changed, or because I'm just tired of the constraint and because I want some cheap dopamine? So the discipline here is really in keeping the review contained and purposeful rather than letting it become an excuse to fling all the doors open again and go back to consuming everything. So you're adjusting the scope of your blindness, not completely removing it. And that distinction matters enormously. So as you grow and as your work deepens, the things that deserve your attention will naturally evolve. And being responsive to that evolution is really a sign of maturity in this practice. So the person who has been selectively blind for a year is not the same person who started, and their blind spots shouldn't be identical either. So sometimes recalibration means expanding your awareness slightly in one area, because maybe you've reached a stage where a specific new input has become genuinely relevant. Let's say you started with a marketing agency, you started a business just marketing agents, but a year later, you're now deciding that the marketing agency will focus specifically on gyms. Well, now some new information might be helpful so you can understand how to serve gyms better, right? So being able to do that deliberately, adding one window while keeping the rest closed, is the advanced version of this skill. And sometimes it means going even narrower than before because you've realized that some of the inputs you initially kept are no longer serving you. And cutting deeper actually feels natural now in a way that would have felt extreme when you started. And where all of this pays off, where the sacrifice of vision turns into something tangible and undeniable. So the rewards of sustained selective blindness don't show up linearly, they compound. They are very slow at first and then all at once in a way that makes the early months of discipline feel almost laughably small compared to what eventually arrives. So the person who has spent a year with a genuinely narrow gaze has built something that the person bouncing between 10 priorities for the same year simply cannot match, regardless of how talented or motivated that second person might be. They might be the most talented person in the world. Still, they won't be able to use that talent if they're scattered across 20 different directions. What you develop through sustained narrowness, focus, in other words, isn't just skill or knowledge, though you get both. You develop a kind of depth of understanding that only comes from prolonged immersion in a single domain. A feeling for the subtle patterns and hidden dynamics that are completely invisible and to anyone still operating at the surface level of that broad awareness. And Cal Newport talks about this in his work on deep focus, the idea that true expertise requires a kind of cognitive intensity that is fundamentally incompatible with scattered attention. So the people who reach genuine mastery in any field didn't get there by knowing a little about a lot of things. Maybe they did, but they got there by also knowing an unreasonable amount about one thing. And the unreasonable part is only possible when you've cut off the competing inputs that would have diluted your immersion. So you go wide and you go narrow. You go wide and you go narrow, essentially, over time. And after enough time in this mode, you will develop what feels like intuition, but is actually pattern recognition, built from thousands of hours of undivided engagement, a gut sense for essentially what will work and what won't. And the way I like to describe pattern recognition is being able to see through walls, because you're able to see things that others don't. And people who spread their attention thin simply never access that. And maybe the most surprising outcome of all of this is that sustained selective blindness eventually produces a kind of freedom that actually feels almost paradoxical. Because by choosing to see less, by choosing to be ignorant on purpose on certain topics, you end up seeing more clearly. By closing doors, you open the one door that actually leads you somewhere. By sacrificing breadth for at least a while, you gain a depth that makes everything you do a lot more powerful. It makes it more resonant and more genuinely yours than anything that ever came from trying to keep every option alive at once. And so there's a specific kind of confidence that only grows in the soil of deep commitment, a quiet certainty that doesn't need external validation because it's rooted in the lived experience of having gone further into one thing than most people are willing to go into anything. And over time, well, that selective blindness will not feel like sacrifice at all and will feel more so like the most natural expression of who you actually are. And you'll be able to just turn it on and turn it off almost like a laser pointing at in a specific direction. Because any moment you want to go deep on something, any moment you actually want to focus on something, you know exactly what to do. Just cut off everything else but that thing, which is maybe the clearest sign that you've crossed over from practicing it into genuinely embodying it. And everything you gave up to get here, the options, the breadth, the social pressure, the discomfort of not knowing what everyone else knows, all of it starts to look like a lot less like sacrifice and a lot more like the smartest trade you ever made, because what you got in return is something that most people spend their entire lives looking for without ever finding it. So with that said, let's cover the review. We covered the overview, the trap of total awareness, training your blind spots, sustaining the narrow gaze, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. First, sit down today and list every single recurring information source in your life, and then eliminate anything that hasn't directly contributed to your primary goal in the last 30 days, regardless of how high quality or interesting it is. Then create a strict daily information window of 30 minutes or an hour or less, and batch all of your catching up into that single container, keeping the rest of your day deliberately and unapologetically blind to everything outside of your lane. And then choose one person in your inner circle and have an honest conversation about what you're doing and why, not to ask for permission, but to establish the boundary out loud so it becomes real and harder to quietly abandon when the pressure builds. If there is a person like that in your life that is constantly sending you short form content, reels, etc., set the boundary. With that said, thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to work with me one-on-one, then again, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you enjoyed this, let me know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.